Okay, I'm going to try and do an impossible task and explain what can't be explained, the philosophy of the Tao. The great thing is that if I fail, I actually explained it perfectly. So let me explain. Taoist is the oldest religion in the Chinese culture. It predates Confucianism, predates Buddhism. In fact, the word Tao, often translated as the way, is often misspelled as Dao, D-A-O, in English to match with the phonetic D instead of with the T. As I always said, it's not Tao, that's a nightclub in Vegas. But Tao is often referred to as Do, where we get the word judo and taekwondo. But let me go back to Tao. The above picture you see here is Lao Tzu, the creator of the Tao, and you can read about him and his legacy in composing the Tao Te Ching online. The character below him is the actual word Tao. And if you know anything about the Chinese language, it depicts two characters, a man walking a big stride, and the other symbol is one of the mind. It's sort of like a box with two lines inside, with branches stemming from the top. This is in reference to the walking of one's own mind to wander and to wonder at the same time. The third image here is the yin and the yang, probably the most famous symbol of the Tao. And you can see it is not a way at all. It's a circle with one side white with a black dot and the other side black with a white dot, fitting to form a circle. And I'll explain shortly how this relates to our philosophy of the way. So you can already have read, you should have already read some of the Tao, and probably a lot of you are thinking to yourselves, well, that made no sense. In fact, that's the point. As one aphorism Lao Tzu writes, this nonsense makes perfect sense. But I'm not going to go over the Tao here. I believe Benjamin Hoff does a pretty good job of explaining the Tao in his book, The Tao of the Pooh. One thing I will say is that the is confusing to the Western mind. Because we think of and we look at the world differently in America and in the West. And this goes beyond language, even beyond religion. We just examine our situation in completely different ways. This is not a bad thing since there's no right or wrong way of viewing the world. But in order to understand the Tao, we must first understand how we think in the West. Now I'm going to do something completely inappropriate, according to a lot of culturalists. I'm going to compare the West to the East. Now, for the longest time, we kept these two separate, I think, in order to avoid any colonialist hegemony. Defining the East under Western eyes is like owning the East, what Edward Said would call the Orientalism. And I understand the argument. Being a comparison myself, I had a habit of comparing, but I've often avoided Orient and Occidental cultures throughout my studies. It's just not done. However, there has been an attempt to compare the two works. But let's first consider Socratic dialectics. Now, this is a very simplified version of the theory, and I'm only going to be focusing on the first part since it's relevant to my ideas. So when we look at the world in the West through this dialectic, the bedrock of our speculative thinking, this is how we form dialogue. A statement is given, that statement is the thesis, an opposing viewpoint is then presented, the antithesis. And this disagreement leads to a synthesis of ideas, which is either in the form of consensus, as Jürgen Habermas likes, or the canceling out, in reference to Hegel's Aufhebung. Either way, we view the world as opposite. So when we look at this chart, we see how we see the world in these dichotomies. And we often favor one side, the left side, over the other. We prefer to be good over bad, right over wrong, etc., etc. And then it leads to prejudices, rich over poor, master over slave, male over female. And with this mindset, we have this wall that divides us. And everyone on the left-hand side of the wall doesn't want it to do with anything on the right-hand side of the wall. And we see this even in our politics too. The left disagrees with everything the right says, and vice versa. We don't even attempt to compromise or come to consensus. We see that our side is right and the other side is wrong, and we need to defeat the other side, or at least to keep them in a marginalized state, out of our way. And that's the West. Our language is really set up this way. Our dialogue, our conversation, relations are set up this way, and this is completely not what Socrates attended. Now, Lao Tzu, in many places of the Tao Te Ching, refers to the center of things, as long as we stay in the center, we will find the way. This aligns to the yin yang circle, that everything is symmetrical and everything is in the middle. Sure, the boundaries are curved, emphasizing fluidity to show the flow of universal force, but everything is centered around the Tao. In fact, the circle is an important part of the agricultural space of the East. If you've ever been to a Japanese bridge and you realize that it's difficult to cross, you have to climb up one side, then turn around and climb back down the other way to get to the other side. It's not an architecturally sound bridge, but the purpose of the bridge is not its utility. It's a half circle on purpose, so that its reflection on the water completes the circle. The Lao Tzu, for Lao Tzu, the center is everything, and this is where you find the Tao or the way. In fact, the one famous aphorism of his states that the problem with people nowadays is that we tend to take the sides paths, and he goes on to write that we must stay in the middle, in the center of things. Thus, to go back to our dialectic, we see that we take the side paths in the West. We choose one side or the other, and we tend to view things, the other side, as the enemy, as our opposition. But in the Eastern culture, it's not so much a contradiction, but complementary. We can't live without the other side. The master needs the slave in some ironic way in order to keep becoming master. But for the East, it's not about right or wrong, or good or bad. It's about unity. So instead of taking the side paths, we have to stay centered. And when we stay centered, we are on the way. And so this is how one would can view the way in a Western mindset, and hopefully it explains enough so that when you read something like um, Benjamin Hoff's The Tao of Pooh, it becomes more clear.